Okay, I think we have a nice group here. We appreciate everyone coming out this evening, a Thursday evening in late May. We appreciate your time, and we know that this is an important topic, hence why you're here. And we have some great speakers for our evening, and truly appreciative of the work that has been happening with our team, DAJAB Integration and Ethics, and our Ethics Commission. And so tonight's Momentum Meetup is bias, ethics, and accountability in artificial intelligence. I am Dr. Varlisha Lyons. I'm the Vice President of DAJAB Integration and Ethics, and I am joined by our team here. We have Angela Warren and Tom Quinn on staff assisting with our evening. And these have been, if you haven't been to a Momentum Meetup before, we've been having them the last Thursday of every month, with some exceptions, such as this summer. And we bring these different topics of innovation, of evolving practice to our community. And the purpose is for engagement. And so after you hear from our speakers, we truly hope that you have some questions and you gather your thoughts so we can have some healthy dialogue around how AI impacts our ethics when it comes to our profession of occupational therapy. So thank you all. And I'm going to, I guess, pass it to Angela.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. So before we get started, we're just going to go over the best practices for an inclusive meeting. This is something that we do every Momentum meetup, excuse me. So if you just bear with me for a few moments, we'll just go through a few slides. So meeting e-professionalism, we all have diverse experiences. We are all one community, whether it's directly or indirectly. And with that, we have to remember that to acknowledge our lived experiences, as well as implicit biases, and integrate cultural humility, not only in this meeting, but in everyday practice. We all have one voice. This meeting is for everyone to participate at your own individual comfort level. Your input is therefore both encouraged and invited throughout this meeting. And we want to include everyone. If you're speaking in a general consensus, we ask you that you use occupational therapy practitioner instead of occupational therapist. That is to be inclusive of both OTs and OTAs. And acknowledge attendee pronouns. Do not assume, generalize, categorize, or stereotype. Just some rules of engagement. The purpose of this meeting is to facilitate both growth and discovery. And we encourage you at your comfort level to turn on your cameras to foster connection and engagement throughout the meeting. Today's meeting will be recorded, and the recording will stop during open discussion so we can just have an environment for a transparent discussion. With that, we invite you to take space and give space. We want to hear everyone's opinion and feedback, but we also want to give everyone the opportunity to do so. With that becomes respectful communication, both verbally and in the chat, that is expected, and inappropriate or offensive comments can be cause for immediate disconnection from the meeting. When speaking, use I statements and try not to overgeneralize, and confront the idea and not the person. And remember and be mindful that every individual is entitled to a personal perspective, vision, and opinion, and this will be a judgment-free and respectful space. And finally, community first. For this topic and all topics in our Momentum Meetup, we ask that you consult your mentors, colleagues, and allies when addressing in practice. And this meeting today, and as well as our Momentum Meetups, supports our AOTA mission, which is to advance occupational therapy practice, education, and research through standard setting and advocacy on behalf of its members, the profession, and the public. And with that, as Berlicia said, today's topic, bias and ethics and accountability in artificial intelligence. Tonight's guests serve on the AOTA Ethics Commission, and we'll discuss how AI can both support and challenge equity in practice. We will begin with presentations, followed by open dialogue with questions and discussion from the audience. And with that, I'd like to briefly introduce our guests for tonight's meetup. First, we have Barbara Elleman. Barbara has been a pediatric occupational therapist for over 30 years. She works at Cincinnati Children's Hospital and is a full-time faculty member at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. She is currently serving her second term as a practice representative for AOTA's Ethics Commission. Barbara has a strong interest in the application of artificial intelligence, or AI, in occupational therapy practice and education, and has served as a panelist for presentations and discussions related to the intersection of ethics and AI. Outside of her work endeavors, Barbara enjoys traveling, playing tennis, and spending time with family and friends and exploring the outdoors. We also would like to welcome Warren Lattimore, who, starting on July 1st, Warren will be an assistant professor of occupational therapy at Duke University School of Medicine, where he will also serve as the director of diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Warren currently serves on the Ethics Commission of AOTA, as well as the AI Curriculum Committee of Duke University School of Medicine, as well as the Board of Trustees at Duke University. So thank you both for being here, and I will pass it on to Warren.
Thank you so much. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a bit of a roadmap of where we will be today. The purpose of this is to open conversation, not to close it. And so for part one, just getting a sense of how each of us is using AI. I'll be using a survey that was done at Duke University School of Medicine, surveying a number of students, faculty, and clinicians about their usage, and then opening it up to see how everyone in the chat has been using it on your end. We'll move on to bias and AI, accountability and AI, code of ethics and AI, and then close out with risks, benefits, and other considerations. So as was mentioned with the Duke University School of Medicine survey, a few hundred clinicians, researchers, faculty, and students were surveyed, first asking the question, how are you using AI in health and healthcare? The largest two, not surprisingly, were reducing administrative burden and personalized education and adaptive learning. So the first engagement wasn't necessarily with a client-centered focus, but on the back end of how we're continuing to learn and grow and how we might be able to reduce some of the administrative burden so we might be able to focus more on the clients as well. Three others that were prominent were enhancing research data analysis and literature reviews, data management, cleaning, and visualization, and then AI-driven simulation for training and education, asking the question of how we might be able to use more case studies or think of them in alternative ways with the use of AI. Next slide. In terms of the importance of expanding knowledge, most, if not all of the respondents recognize that using AI in health and well-being was extremely important or very important for almost all of the respondents. It was moderately important and slightly important for about 26 out of the 200 or so respondents. Next slide. As for motivations, this is where some of the aspects of thinking about why we are using it instead of just thinking about how it's used. For some, the desire to keep up with emerging technologies. We'll mention this later on in the code of ethics, that professional development is one of the things that we're called to do, especially with emerging technologies. So that was a motivation for about 65 of the respondents. But understanding the importance of work-life balance that connects with the administrative workload. If we can lower the administrative burden and focus more on the client-centered or the client-facing side of things, all the better. Increasing efficiency in clinical practice on the hospital side and on the clinician side, that is particularly interesting for the respondents. Career advancement and improving patient outcomes rounds out the top five. Next slide. In terms of our topic for today, in terms of bias and fairness and health equity, in terms of the interest in learning more about health AI, the fifth most popular was bias and fairness in AI, recognizing that while they were using AI, they weren't necessarily trained in ways of thinking about bias and fairness, especially on health equity as it relates to the use of AI in a clinical setting. Fourth was introduction to AI concepts and terminology, just being on the same page because many of the people responded as being novices or inexperienced with the use of AI, even if they were dabbling in it themselves. Ethical and legal considerations in AI and electronic health records. At Duke, we're using a software called or a system called Ambient AI for transcription within Duke University Health System, and thinking about the use of AI in electronic health records, in transcriptions, and the like is something that the respondents wanted to learn more about. And the top concern was understanding AI limitations and risks. And so the ethical and legal considerations, bias and fairness, and limitations and risks go hand in hand. And hopefully that'll be something that we'll be talking about in the second half of our time together. So next slide. So the question that I want to ask for each of you in the chat is, how are you using it? Are you using it already in the clinical context? Are you using it with clients? Are you using it on the administrative side? If you're in education, are you using it to teach or to learn? I just wanted to see a few of the responses, but also for each of you to get a sense of where everyone's coming from in case you might be able to connect with a peer or colleague about working with AI in your shared settings. And we got a few coming in. So administration, teaching, therapy, communication. We've already got some of the gamut just in the first four responses. Education, again, trying to teach students how to use it properly by demonstrating use. I teach, currently I'm teaching ethics information for service over the summer to OTD students here at Duke. And one of the conversations that we have is about not just the usage of a technology, but the ethical usage of a technology. And before we even think about having them use it out in the clinical setting, how are they using it as students in this place? Are they giving proper attribution? Are they using it in ways that help their learning or maybe don't promote their learning? How do we support them in the usage, recognizing that it's a common tool, but also help them recognize the risks and the pitfalls? A few more: productivity around academic tasks, using AI in home health, improving writing, tone, and flow. I think that one's definitely helpful. We use nonviolent communication in our educational setting. Sometimes I might write something and I'm not sure how it sounds. And so being able to get a second opinion, maybe not the first opinion, about how it might sound, or if it's a little too violent in language, can be helpful as well. So a number of great responses, and there's resonance with the likes and sharing. So I will leave it there to make sure we have time for proper sharing at the very end. So next slide. So before I pass it over to Barb, when we talk about artificial intelligence, sometimes we talk about it as a behemoth, just like a general thing, but there are various different types and there's different risks, especially as it relates to bias, health equity concerns, ethical considerations, and the like. The first to emerge was analytic AI. Basically, the idea of large language models was that there was a large language model, that there was a large amount of data that people were using to notice patterns, predictive algorithms as such. Before it was analytic AI, one of the types of talk that used similar language was digital humanities, that looked at the entire corpus of Shakespeare or the entire corpus of Homer and looked at patterns, that predictive patterns within the writing. Or if over the course of time, Shakespeare used the word beseech less in his later life than earlier life, what could that say about his state of mind? So that's first, it was used to analyze text, not necessarily to generate text. After that was generative AI, which we tend to use mostly with ChatGPT and other sorts of common tools. It can generate images, text, audio, and the like. It uses that predictive algorithm, but instead of predicting what has been, predicting what will be. And so generative AI has been the thing most people engage with when they engage in tools like Gemini, ChatGPT, Claude, and the like. More recent models in the past year have been reasoning models. These are where a thought process is in line. It's still based on generative AI, but it's a self-thinking or self-reasoning sort of model. Instead of saying the first thing that comes to mind, for lack of a better term, it gives that idea and then assesses its viability, either based on some sort of parameters that have been given or some other sort of logical reasoning model that has been produced. So it's meant to produce better answers because it's going through a logical process that we might use in our own context. We're going to be sharing an ethical decision-making framework that we use, not in AI, but on the OT side of things. This would use something similar to that. And then lastly, and I think in terms of adaptive technologies and things that might actually get into the hospitals or into the home settings. This is what is called agentic AI, and this is much more closely related to delegating tasks. So thinking about robots or autonomous scheduling agents or wearables, each of these goes beyond the generative AI to actually influencing things like the internet or things along those lines. And so I'll take that as my cue to the next slide. So we'll move on to bias in AI, and I'll hand it over to Barb.
Thank you very much. So there is a quote that I don't know who it is attributed to, but the AI is like a mirror of our past and present society. If we don't clean the mirror, we keep seeing the distorted reflections. And I think that just encompasses some of the inherent bias that we're going to find in AI, artificial intelligence, no matter how we use it. There is bias that we know in our data, in our interactions, and it's unavoidable, and that shows up in the artificial intelligence. Next slide. The bias in AI tends to categorize into three separate areas. It can be data related, design related, or deployment related. The data related bias is really that embedded data that is there before the AI model is even built or trained. So the AI information that the artificial intelligence tool is trained on is inherently biased. There can be historical bias, which reflects past discrimination. There can be representation bias, where the results or the data does not reflect a diverse population, or there are unbalanced data sets that don't reflect diversity and representation of all. There can be measurement bias, where scores are inaccurately reflected what they intended to measure. This list is not all inclusive. These are just some examples. Bias can also be design related and reflected in how the data is actually processed. And this can show up in algorithmic bias, where variables might be weighted higher or as more important than some other variables. And I'll give an example of that in a minute. Or confirmation bias, where models may be tuned to support specific outcomes. And then the deployment related bias, that shows up in how AI is used or misused by humans. Automation, if humans over rely on AI recommendations, they may be flawed, they may be inaccurate, they may be biased and not representative of the full population. And if we're over relying on that, then there's automation bias. Contextual misuse, where an AI tool is used in a different context in a way that it was not intended. And then measurement bias, how information is used in practice. And I'll give you a few examples on the next slide. And I'm actually going to share my screen and just show you one simple little example that I've used with some of the students that I've taught in my classes. Let me find let's see, here we go. This is a tool. Here we go. I can't tell if you can see my screen. Are we good?
Yes, we're seeing
Okay.
it.
This is a tool called Deep AI that generates images, and it allows, it has a feature that I find fun, where you can interact with the image and ask questions. So I put in just a simple prompt: create an image of an autistic person that entry-level occupational therapist students can interact with to learn about autism. And so it's going to generate an image. Okay. And I've done this a couple of times. 9 times out of 10, it's a male. And then you can talk to the image. So I'm going to act as a student and just ask this image, what are some of your hobbies? What are some things that you like and dislike? I hold up a picture I drew with vibrant stickers. I love playing with stickers. They're so much fun to collect and trade with my friends. I like drawing. I like building with blocks. I like playing with Play-Doh, watching cartoons, watching my favorite cartoons, Paw Patrol, playing with sensory toys. I love animals. Dislikes are loud noises or new foods, changes in routine, certain textures. But where the bias is in this is I've played with this a few times, and usually there is something related to blocks and stacking blocks, and certainly not all autistic individuals enjoy blocks. Usually there is something with loud noises, and usually there are some problems with squishy and slimy textures, and certainly individuals who are autistic may have certain sensory preferences, but it's not consistent across the board. And when you are using artificial intelligence, it's prioritizing patterns, and it's prioritizing patterns that it sees regularly, and highlighting patterns that it sees regularly. So this could be flawed if that is the only picture that this is presenting of an individual, an autistic individual. Okay. Next, and let's see slides. Okay, some other examples, go back real quick, Angela, sorry. Some other examples of bias in AI use is, we're going to talk about it later, so I don't want to give too many, but if we use artificial intelligence to detect falls, say, or to predict falls risk in some of our clients, then if a hospital-based AI tool is used in a community-based settings, it might not be adapted for some of the at-home barriers, or at-home, sorry, I'm not thinking of the right word, at-home modifications that could be adapted, and it may over-predict or under-predict falls risk. Same thing if we are using it and over-relying on it with documentation and not necessarily checking documentation, or over-relying on it for predictive output for some of our treatment planning. There can be errors and flaws if we're using it to predict referrals for OTs, if the data that has been loaded into that AI tool has an underrepresentation of a certain socioeconomic population or a geographic location, because those individuals have not had occupational therapy services. The AI tool may look at that as that population doesn't benefit from occupational therapy services, and so it may again, kind of reinforce that underserved population. So we're going to talk some more about potential bias in our discussion. Next slide. And next, I'll throw it back to Warren to talk about a little bit about some of the accountability in AI.
Excellent. So with the presence of bias and the recognition of health equity issues, not just within AI, but more importantly, within the data that feeds the AI systems that we are using, we can toss it back to the AI agents, to the AI tools, to the AI developers and say, this is something that they have to figure out. But if we're using the tools, we have to be able to use them responsibly, and we are accountable to any sort of output that we put our name to. And so being aware of that and thinking about the guardrails that are present is important. So next slide. So to be able to think about that, I want to approach two types of the AIs that I had mentioned before, generative/reasoning AI and agentic AI. I want to approach them in different ways because we'll be able to work with them in different contexts. With generative AI, as I mentioned, with ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and the like, the main way that we interact with that artificial intelligence system is through prompts and prompt engineering. And the basic structure of many prompts is first defining the role. So something like, I am an occupational therapy practitioner, or you are an occupational therapy practitioner. Two, task. What specific thing do you want the AI tool to do? The input and output, I will be giving you text, or I will be giving you audio, or I will be giving you this 20-page book. I want you to, and then the output, what sort of thing you want it to produce. In 300 words or less, or in 1,000 words, I want you to blank. Or in 5 images, I want you to help give a visual representation about this particular adaptive technology, so my client might be able to understand how to use it when they're back home. Something along those lines. And then constraints, and this is the one that I want to focus on. Constraints is the one that often gets overlooked, but the constraint is how we are trying to put a clamp on AI, because AI is all of information that it has in the system. The more you narrow it, maybe a constraint is only use peer evidence-based research from occupational therapy journals or journals of occupational science. And then you limit the scope or the constraints of what it will see as valid information. And then finally, capabilities and reminders. It's almost just reminding it what it already knows, but something like, you have access to the internet, or based on today's date, please provide information that is relevant for the current news cycle, or something along those lines. So out of those 5, that generally is one prompt. Sometimes we only focus on the task or only the input or the output, but the broader our prompt engineering is, the more we can try to mitigate some of the harm by bias within the system itself. So next slide, please. And even within that, generative AI has a number of constraints, or different types of constraints that we can lean into. Format constraints is just simply, how do we want the information in paragraphs and tables, in bullet points, and the like. Length constraints, as I mentioned before, do we want it 100 words? Do we want it 1,000 words? The more information we give it, the more it'll be constrained within that style. One of the respondents talked about improving our writing tone and style. We can also ask the generative AI, ChatGPT, to change the style or the tone, whether more formal or explanatory or informal and the like. And that itself is a constraint in how it responds. For content, this one's important in that it's what we want it to include or exclude or emphasize in the response. So I alluded to this when I said something along the lines of, you are an occupational therapy practitioner, you are an educator of occupational science, I want you to blank. It helps limit what sorts of responses it will give. while teaching. Some of you may have experienced already if your students are using AI too soon and too quickly, and they ask for some sort of response about occupation, and the response that you get in the prep guide is about the jobs that they have. It might be a sense that the AI is thinking about occupation broadly instead of within the context of occupational science or occupational therapy. So it's a trigger or a warning that they might not be constrained within occupational therapy itself. And then finally, role constraints overlaps with that context. You are an occupational therapy practitioner. I want you to respond in this sort of way. So content and role are similar, but it helps bring a particular type of constraint. A different way to see this is as a lens. So you are taking a lens of a person well versed in health equity. Understanding that, how would you respond to blank? And so then it would take more of a health equity lens than it otherwise might take, and think about its responses in that sort of way. So next slide. Oops. But the guardrails themselves are not sufficient, because sometimes we think, well, if we just put enough guardrails in, then it'll solve the problems of AI. That if we say we want more diversity, then it'll give us more diversity and the algorithm will be solved. But as Google Gemini discovered not too long ago, they had some issues, as Barb was mentioning, that the sorts of images that were being generated were predominantly white and predominantly male. And so they said, well, let's just make everyone diverse. But the problem was with such a hand-fisted or such a sleight of hand to try to insert an easy guardrail to be pro-diversity, what it ended up doing was you would ask, show me a picture of a 1943 German soldier, and the person would be Black or Asian or of any sort of background other than German 1943 Nazi soldier. And so there was a lot of pushback on that and some other contexts, the founding fathers all being African American with white enslaved individuals, that it really created some sort of problem with the sort of image generation that it was doing. And so it required a response by the product lead. I might not read all of it, but I think it's relevant because of how they talked about their AI principles, which are very minute. They're not quite as robust as the AOTA Code of Ethics about how they are thinking about this, but they take representation and bias seriously, which is why they said this ended up happening. But they recognize that there's a difference between generative AI creating a generic person, like an image of a person walking a dog that they consider universal, and historical context. And so they said that this process of creating guardrails is an iterative or an alignment process, that it's based on feedback. And we'll talk about feedback more later on, but the recognition that we can't just put in a guardrail and think that everything now has been solved. The complexity just goes all the way down. As the expression goes, it's turtles all the way down. So next slide, please. For agentic AI, where it's actually using software and hardware out in the real world, this becomes more problematic because it can actually control down the road machines, assisted devices, and the like, which means that if it has the wrong data or the wrong input, it can cause physical harm to our clients or to ourselves. And the domains is what they call it for agentic AI. I won't go through it for the sake of time, but the text is there for you to see: models, tools, knowledge and memory, audio and speech. And then the last two are guardrails, which is meant to prevent irrelevant, harmful, and undesirable behavior. That comes on near the tail end. After you've constructed this agentic AI, you need to think about what sorts of guardrails, what sorts of things will it say or not say. There were issues of suicidal ideation coming from some chatbots. Do we want to prevent it from doing that? If it's got other sorts of things, undesirable behavior, like causing harm to others, do we want to put a guardrail on that? And orchestration, we'll talk more about this, but the idea that just when we create it, that isn't enough, but we have to develop, deploy, monitor, and improve agents. So how do we build within the system a mechanism to see if it's perpetuating health inequities that might already exist? And if it is, how can we have an iterative process where we put guardrails on the guardrails to try to mitigate any harm that it might have been doing so that we can improve it in each beta version as such. So next slide. This is a quote from OpenAI's platform regarding guardrails, and I think it's helpful. It's a bit of a pitch for what they're selling, but it applies across agentic AI domains. Guardrails ensure your agents behave safely, consistently, and within your intended boundaries, critical for production deployments. They want you to use OpenAI's free moderation API to automatically filter unsafe content, but every AI agent has its own that you can use. Further control your agent's behavior by leveraging the instruction hierarchy. There's a link to that, but it's a different sort of way of thinking about the priority of prompts, which prioritizes developer-defined prompts over user-defined prompts and mitigates unwanted agent behaviors. Next slide. And so with the guardrails in mind, we can't put in generic guardrails, but rather thinking through the lens of occupational therapy and more particularly the AOTA Code of Ethics. And for that, I'll pass it back to Barb.
Okay, so we wanted to just spend a few minutes highlighting some of the concepts from the Code of Ethics, particularly the standards of conduct that could apply to AI. Next slide, please. So just as a reminder, the Code of Ethics is organized by aspirational core values, ethical principles, and enforceable standards of conduct. The core values are defined in the code to guide our interactions with others. These reflect our professional occupational therapy, profession of occupational therapy values, and they should be considered when we find ourselves facing an ethical dilemma or when we find ourselves at a crossroads of sorts. The code was just revised and just approved through the Representative Assembly. It will be published, the 2025 version will be published in the supplement of AJOT at the end of this year. Next slide, please. So then we have the principles, the guiding ethical principles, and these are also are aspirational in value. We have 6 ethical principles that guide our ethical actions. They're aspirational. This code specifically refers to them, but outlines specific standards of conduct that relate to these principles. And those are the enforceable standards of conduct. Next slide. The enforceable standards of conduct, while they're linked to the principles, are organized according to desired professional behaviors. These are professional integrity, therapeutic relationships, documentation, reimbursement, financial matters, service delivery, competence and education, and communication. And we just wanted to share a few of the standards of conduct that relate specifically to artificial intelligence. Next slide, please. One that was added to the most recent revision of the Code of Ethics is the use of artificial intelligence in documentation requires acknowledgement of resources in the document, whether it's clinical, professional, or through academic activities. So it's important that we are transparent when we are using artificial intelligence for documentation or for interactions. And so this is just one of those enforceable standards that that says that we should just include that. It falls under the documentation, reimbursement, and financial matters, and it's just so that we are transparent, so that our clients know that when we are using artificial intelligence, and we're just being transparent about that. When I went to a doctor's appointment recently, that was something that I had that was disclosed to me, that they wanted to use artificial intelligence, that the interaction would be recorded and the note would be created from that interaction, and then it would be reviewed from the physician, and I had to consent for that. Next slide, please. And that's what this next standard of conduct is. And this has not changed except slightly in wording for clarity of wording, but It's important that we obtain consent for any type of information that we are in any type of service that we are providing. So obtain consent, whether it's written, verbal, electronic, or implied, after disclosing appropriate information, and artificial intelligence falls under that category. And I'll pass it over to Warren.
So as an educator, like Barb, another aspect that we care about with AI and with all emerging technologies is under Section 5, professional competence, education, supervision, and training, with the recognition that we are called to take steps in terms of professional development, research, supervision, and training to ensure proficiency, use careful judgment, and weigh potential for harm when generally recognized standards do not exist in emerging technology or areas of practice. So this connects with accountability. Just because there might not be something explicit in the code of ethics doesn't mean that we don't have an ethical responsibility to think about how we are using it, whether or not it's approved at our local hospital or clinical or educative setting. That our responsibility is first to ask, is this an emerging technology? If it is, are there recognized standards? If there are not recognized standards, what is the potential for harm to be caused? And so to go through either the ethical decision-making framework or to think about ways that this technology, while it could be used positively, could also be used in a way that might not cause the beneficence for the well-being of the client. But the flip side, and I'll mention this later on, is what's called the digital divide bias. That sometimes, because we might be afraid of an emerging technology, especially for marginalized and vulnerable populations, we might be disinclined to use it. But the digital divide bias is that oftentimes, the technology that can be used to help with health equity doesn't get used among marginalized populations out of fear of its misuse, and then it creates inequity, a boundary or a barrier between those who have access to those technologies and are using them in clinical settings and those who aren't using them in other sorts of settings. And it actually increases the health equity or the digital divide bias as such. So being abreast of the literature, knowing how to use the technologies, even if you make the conscious and intentional decision not to use it, is part of our standards of practice, a part of our recognition that we have an obligation, especially for marginalized communities, to understand the benefits and the risks for emerging technologies. So next slide. And then finally, communication, and multiple of you mentioned communication as how it can be useful and helpful, whether in written, verbal, electronic, or virtual communication. OT personnel uphold the highest standards of confidentiality, informed consent, autonomy, accuracy, timeliness, and record management. One thing that you can just assume is that if the AI system is not localized on your computer, as in it needs the internet, you can assume that whatever patient health information you put in there is public information. And if you approach it like that, then you can be more mindful about what sorts of information you provided and which sorts you might not, recognizing the privacy of and confidentiality of the information of your protected health information. But in addition to that, 6H says that we're also called to give credit and recognition when using the ideas and work of others in written, oral, or electronic media. In other words, don't plagiarize. And while we might not consider, we might readily recognize that if we copy paste out of one of the major textbooks that we use in the classroom or in an AJOT article or so forth, that we might get in trouble because we're plagiarizing someone else's ideas. The flip side is, even though the generative AI has produced text that never existed before, those aren't your words and those aren't your ideas. And the worst part about it is that it's not peer-reviewed, evidence-based literature. It's an amalgamation of words that may or may not be true. And that's all the more reason to give credit and recognition when using AI because of its possibility of having hallucinations, of being factually inaccurate, of perpetuating health inequities within the data and the like. So making sure that if in doubt, give credit and recognition. And also, if you're publishing and a researcher, know that every journal has a different policy as it relates to artificial intelligence, whether or not it allows it at all, whether it allows it with attribution, whether it allows it or encourages it more freely, recognizing that since every academic journal is different, knowing what your particular academic journal says you can and cannot use so you don't run afoul of that particular publisher. So next slide. So risks, benefits, and other considerations. That's me? Yeah, next slide. Sorry. In Duke University Health System, the CEO, Craig, has a saying that he repeats all the time to everybody. He says when patients or clients come into the hospital, they all basically want three things. They say, heal me, don't hurt me, and hear me. And a question that we have with the use of AI is, does AI help in each of those, either individually or collectively, or does it cause harm? Does it increase the health and well-being, heal me, of our clients? Does it risk causing harm, whether intentional or unintentional, through its use, misuse, or failure to use? And hear me, does the use of the technology, as we mentioned, with administrative tasks, with transcription and the like, allow for more authentic, more person-to-person, therapist-to-client interaction? And so asking those questions can help us think about the benefits, the risks of using AI technology. So next slide. To return to the survey results just for a little bit afterwards, I just think I was going to create my own chart, but then I realized that the feedback from the students, clinicians, and faculty were better than what I could necessarily put together. They put their hopes for AI and their fears of AI, and it's a good chart to think about risks and benefits of AI, potential risks and benefits as such. The number one, far and away, hope that they have for AI that it'll achieve in health and healthcare is improving patient outcomes. The goal is to enhance diagnostics, treatment accuracy, and predictive analytics, and to reduce medical errors and refining clinical decision-making. There's been studies about AI usage in detecting breast cancer, its ability to handle large language models. So in theory, it can down the road handle large language models as it relates to mRNA and the like, to maybe produce more vaccines and the like. So ultimately, if we're anchored in client-centered care, our number one hope for AI is that it improves client-centered care. But beyond that, there's the hope that it reduces clinician burnout and administrative burden. We're all burnt out in a variety of ways. We might be experiencing moral distress, facing ethical dilemmas. Our workload might be too taxing as such. The goal for many people is to streamline the charting, documentation, and scheduling. The things that don't actually involve me with the client, can I reduce that workload so I can be more present with the clients? And automating routine tasks to improve work-life balance. For some of the respondents, it was the recognition that while we talk about AI in healthcare, are there ways that we can use it outside of healthcare to create more work-life balance so that when I show up to work, I can show up as my full, authentic, hopefully semi-rested self. And then increasing equity and access to care was the third most common response, standardizing care and reducing disparities. Sometimes we think that the data is the only problem when it comes to bias and when it comes to health equity issues, but sometimes we're the problem. And so thinking about AI as maybe not a tool to replace us, but as a dialogue partner to ask the question, what questions am I leaving out? If I were to take a health equity lens, how might I think about this problem or this patient or this topic a little differently? So not necessarily to replace our thinking, but to be able to allow us to have a certain amount of cultural humility that even if we might be too proud to listen to our friends or colleagues, maybe in the privacy of our own home, we might be willing to listen to an AI chatbot as such, not to replace again, but to add another level of dialogical reflection. Fourth, optimizing efficiency and workflow related to reducing clinician burnout, minimizing redundant administrative tasks. And then five, ethical AI implementation and human collaboration. addressing bias and ensuring responsible AI usage, and supporting rather than replacing human decision making. So again, it's more helpful to think of this as a partner, like someone alongside of you, than as a tool, because as a tool, you might think of it as replacing your thought process. But as a partner or a dialogue, a person with whom to dialogue, you might think of it more iteratively, like in a conversation back and forth. So next slide. And then what are your major concerns? If those were the benefits or the potential hopes of using AI for the good of healthcare, what are some of the major concerns? The obvious one, just straight off the bat, is accuracy and errors. They call it a black box model, meaning we don't know what happens inside. Even the top AI experts say, we know how we created it and we understand the outputs, but what happens in between is a bit of a black box, is a bit of an enigma. Sometimes the hallucinations surprise even the people who develop these technologies. And so there's a risk of false information and clinical errors, the amplification of misinformation in EHRs and the like. And so recognizing that. Two, ethical considerations and bias. While it was fifth on the hopes, it's second on the fears. Concerns about AI-driven disparities and bias in healthcare, digital divide bias that I mentioned before, the need for a responsible and transparent implementation. We'll talk about transparency later on, but if we can't see what's going on, our client definitely can't see what's going on. And if they can't see what's going on, can they trust the output? Can they trust the recommendation that we provide if we don't even understand the information that's provided? And then third, privacy and data security. I mentioned this before. Currently, it's a privacy risk. There are companies and technologies. I said at Duke, we use ambient AI. If there are internal systems that keep it within a particular network, there's higher security. But if you're using it at home, I would say don't trust it as far as you can type on it. And fourth, impact on clinical skills and patient interaction. This might come up in our discussions as such. If we're always relying on this to do clinical reasoning, might we lose our ability to do clinical reasoning? Or if we use it for ethical decision making, might we lose our own ability to reflect on the ethical decision making process? And then fifth, this one is close to home for me because I work in climate commitment work at Duke, but we might not think of this as an equity issue, but the usage of AI has negative impacts for environmental and research challenges. It uses a lot of power and it uses a lot of water. And oftentimes, as we think about climate change, the people most impacted by climate change are those who are the most marginalized communities. And so recognizing that, just naming that, regardless of how we think about using it or not using it and the like, is an important consideration. There's uncertain funding for AI infrastructure and support, and given its high energy and resource demands for AI technology, one, does it increase cost? Two, does it increase harm? Next slide. I'm going to slow down a little bit here just because this is a helpful one, not to think about in order to use AI, we should do this, but if we are using AI, if the hospital, if the school has already approved it, to think through these steps or these particular practical guardrails that you don't need any sort of coding knowledge in order to apply. The first one is just simply purpose and scope boundaries, clear definitions of what the AI tool should and should not be used for. So if we're in a school setting, if we're in a clinical setting, where can it be used and where specifically should we not use it, and specifying it, just like we use all sorts of other technologies, all sorts of other policies to how we handle patient information. AI should have the same sort of standards, if not more, about the purpose limitations in clinical protocols and specific clinical scenarios where the AI tool is appropriate. Human in the loop requirements just simply refers to protocols that ensure human oversight and judgment at critical decision points. If there is a life or death decision, we do not want AI to make the final decision. It can input, just as I said, it can be a partner alongside, but it should never have the final say. Recognize that there are important pause points along the usage of AI, whether or not it's approved in a particular context. And then transparent documentation. We mentioned this before. If we're using AI, we, as in the AOTA Code of Ethics, are called to be transparent, to be truthful about what we are doing and what we are using, so that we can allow our clients to have autonomy in its usage. So clear records of when and how AI is being used in patient care. One of the things is that you cannot improve what you cannot measure. And if you are not transparent about the documentation of its usage, you cannot measure whether or not it's being used well or inappropriately. And so that transparent documentation connects to regular performance monitoring, just systematic tracking of AI tool performance and outcomes. As I mentioned before, the process is iterative. Google Gemini messed it up. They tried to fix it. They put guardrails on the guardrails. If you're not monitoring, if you're not keeping track of what's going well and what's going wrong, then the people who are most impacted by it will be the ones with the smallest voice. And if they have the smallest voice, we might not listen to them, and we might continually cause the same harm over and over again. And for that, we have to make the feedback mechanisms easier along the way. Just structured processes for reporting concerns or unexpected results. Just like we have different sorts of discharge forms about client experience within the healthcare system, if we're using AI, especially with clients, having some sort of feedback mechanism where they can give feedback about its use or misuse. Clear channels, clear documentation, clear tracking, and clear AI performance tools to recognize if patient outcomes are improving or getting worse over time. And just like we mentioned in the AOTA Code of Ethics, if we're going to be using this in a serious way, to have continuing education requirements, to recognize that AI literacy is just like other sorts of literacies. If we're using this tool, we have to be able to use it in a way that we're not amateur or novices in the usage. If we're using other sorts of technology, whether in cancer or rehabilitative techniques or the like, and we're expected to have certification or training with that, if we're using AI to impact health outcomes, we should have a similar continuing education requirement for its usage in the clinical setting, especially if it's being used on patients or with patients. If it's on the administrative side, then that could be a different sort of conversation. And then lastly, an ethical review process, whatever this looks like. Basically, whether within your organization, your institution, your school, or the like, some sort of structured evaluation of ethical implications before adopting new AI tools. A couple of years ago, well, for the past couple of years, we've had the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, and thinking about how doctors at the time thought that they were doing good because they had one ethical consideration in their mind, the utilitarian most good for the greatest number, but it meant that marginalized peoples and populations ended up being on the short end of the stick, so to say. And so recognizing that. And so next slide.
And so we wanted to leave with two potential tools and just some additional thoughts when you're deciding whether you're going to use an AI tool, some considerations to think. So here's a checklist. It's not all inclusive, but we tried to provide as much as we could think of. Who created the AI tool, and why was it created? Was it created for profit? Was it created for a nonprofit? Was it created by the government? Was it created by private company? Understanding who created it and what the purpose was can help you decide if how you're applying it is appropriate. What data train the AI tool and who is represented in that data. We might not always be able to get that information, but trying to gather that information and understand what decisions and patterns are being recognized based on the data, and what potential bias might be involved in that. Does it support and protect client autonomy? And this, I think, is extremely important. And with that, we think of privacy also. The client autonomy, client choice, and client privacy needs to be first and foremost with our decisions on if we're going to use an AI tool. Is it accessible to clients of all abilities, cultures, and languages? Is it something that can be adaptable to a variety of clients and a variety of situations? Could it reinforce bias or exclusion? or does it mitigate it? That's another consideration. And then another one that I think is highly important is, does it complement or replace clinical reasoning? I always tell my students that AI should complement their critical thinking. It should not replace it. And replacing their critical thinking is a misuse in my courses. So the same applies with clinical use. Does it complement your decision making, or does it replace the clinical reasoning? We want to make sure that the occupational therapy practitioner is the one making the decisions, and the one who is client-centered and who is focused on the client, and it's not relying completely on decisions, machine decisions. And then lastly, next slide. Everybody's probably familiar with different ethical decision-making frameworks. This one is adapted just for consideration for artificial intelligence. Anytime you're faced with any type of ethical situation or ethical crossroads, using a decision-making framework that is very similar to this is very helpful. So this one's adapted by our colleague on the Ethics Commission, Ashley Wagner. So we've adapted it for artificial intelligence. But you first want to gather information. What's the data? What's the details? What population is this? Train the model. What outcome is the AI designed to predict? Then you want to identify any potential ethical concerns. Is there a risk to autonomy, justice, or the potential for harm, such as Warren highlighted? Is a specific population specifically at risk? And then you want to prioritize, weigh values, weigh consequences, consider all the stakeholders, consider alternatives, even alternatives that are more manual and non-automated. Can the AI output be validated through clinical reasoning? And then you decide on an action, and you want to center and prioritize your values, principles, and actions. Use the code of ethics, and use the core values and the ethical principles to help guide those decisions. Decide whether to use, adapt, or reject the use of AI. Share your reasoning, again, for that feedback purpose. And then know that you're responsible for those results. Like that is your license, your decision, and you need to be able to own and defend your decision. And then reflect and evaluate. As occupational therapy practitioners, we always want to be reflective, so that we can learn from decisions and become better for our clients. So reflect on the outcomes, reflect on how values were or were not upheld, learn, share, and advocate with others. And so just approaching our artificial intelligence with the lens of ethics, and first and foremost, and your client first and foremost, is first and foremost the most important thing to do. And so with that, I will pass it to Angela for our discussion and questions. So hopefully we've given you some food for thought for discussion, and we welcome any ideas or just, this is a great area, so we welcome any ideas or questions.
All right. Thank you, Warren and Barbara, for such a comprehensive and really valuable presentation. At this time, I'm going to stop recording and then open up for discussion, as Barbara alluded to.